native. I remember there was a big flood, and they've got the what are used as a canoe in the Miles Museum now, and there was a drover caught up a tree in the middle of a flood, and it was about 300 metres wide, and the water was swirling down, and there was logs and trees and everything coming down at a huge rate, and the most dangerous was these big eddies that were around the trunks of trees, and if you got caught in one of those, well, they just sucked you down. And there was a guy caught up on a tree, and my father happened to hear him calling out, and even though we lived 2 miles away, he'd just been down there and happened to hear him. So he didn't know how he was going to get him, because he was way over the other side of the creek, and the telephone lines were down, and there was nobody there. And so he raced back to our house and got a little tiny cattle trough, and he took the planks off 2 packing cases and used those as oars and dragged the canoe all the way down and rowed out to get the man. And when he was rowing, the water was lapping because it was only about 6 inches deep, and the man fell off the tree because he'd been there overnight and he was so cold, and he just fell into the canoe. And my father took him to the other side because that was closer, and he didn't know his name or anything, and he rowed back, paddled the cattle trough back, and they didn't meet up for another 20 years. It was 20 years before they met again, and so that was an interesting story.
Oh yeah, I remember that. I remember going in the canoe and like seeing basically just rowing over the entire bloody paddock, and then rowing over the neighbour's paddock, and going over 30-foot trees that were completely submerged. And then we got attacked by a bunch of sandflies, so I slapped Andrew's back, and we almost capsized and lost all the video cameras in the water. That was a moment and a half, I tell you. And then rode here and rode there. That was so much fun. Just basically going exploring and rowing. That was great. Love that. I love that. And then the bit where Andrew is getting pissed off because she couldn't have a smoke, and so they dropped him in by helicopter or whatever.
Well, all the neighbours' properties went down under, and we were using the canoe and that to paddle over the top of other people's property and have a look at their acreage that didn't exist anymore. There were places like the Mnemonic Hotel where the cows to get out of the water actually went and stood on the hotel's veranda, because that was the highest point in town. We couldn't get into town. We were out there for 17 days. We were cut off. And the water got within about 20 metres of the house. So all in all, we were pretty lucky, but we never got any snakes. For some reason, the snakes never came near us, and we were pretty lucky again. And the other thing is, when the water lies on the ground long enough, it makes the ground go rotten, because it sort of goes like a sponge and it won't bear weight. And a vehicle will drive down a track and the track just crumbles under the vehicle and it just
gets bogged
and sits there. Yeah, Uncle Dave did that because Uncle Dave knew what he was doing, and Uncle Dave got bogged.
Well, we're talking about floods and that. I remember back in 2011 getting flooded in Kaladi.
Yes, and you would, and there's something very, I suppose, close to nature when you're out there in that terrible flooding rain and just seeing the water rising higher and higher, and wondering if the water's going to reach the house, which it never did. And it's a very moving experience being that close to nature, and to know that there's no way that you can get out or get in, and that you're completely isolated and cut off. And it was just lucky we had plenty of food, so we can thank your grandfather's worker bee like hoarding of food that we did. And we had
heaps of food. Well, I like to hoard a little bit, and your grandmother did the same. Anything was on special was always bought in bulk and then jammed into the pantry or up one of the sheds. I mean, we had about half a ton of washing powder at one stage up in the shed. That was quite interesting. Yes, it gave us all a reason to chuckle. But the big thing with floods, of course, is nobody can work. Nobody can go anywhere, nobody can get food, nobody can do a thing. But one of the funny things that happened was, from the creek to the highway was about 1 kilometre. And one of the blokes, for a bit of a joke, had a fishing rod. He put a bit of bait in the hook and he hoiked it out over the water, and it landed in the water over the highway, and the water was about 3 or 4 foot deep there, and he caught a fish. Yes, he caught a yellow belly. So anybody who jokes about fishing in buckets or anything else should have been out there that day. This guy caught the fish.
Food there, didn't we, to feed how many? There was 9 or 11 of us for something like 11 days. Yeah.
Yeah, we probably could have like at least gone out for a month.
Yeah, well, we probably could have. We had enough food stockpiled. And that's something that you always had to be aware of, especially when I was growing up as a young girl, was that you didn't have the same access to shops that we do, even out there now. You know, it was 10-minute run, but back then, living further out, you know, it was a big, big thing to go into town. And it's changed. It's no longer as isolated as what it was. And coming down to Brisbane, I can remember that we used to camp halfway, whereas now it takes us 5 hours to drive out. Back then we'd pack up and head out the night before. We'd camp at Rangers Bridge in just before Dalby, and then we wouldn't hit Brisbane till about 5 o'clock the next day. So it was a real, you know, exodus to travel down to Brisbane then. You felt very much more countrified.